Now it's time to gear towards the fascinating debates that we are set to have in the next 2 days. The opening talk is really inspired to trigger the discussion on the topic that we are discussing here, so the interface between science and science policy. The title of the talk is The Relevance of Putting Science to the Service of Policymaking to Contribute to Advancing Global Challenges. So I invite on stage the speaker, Lorenzo Melchor. He's a policy analyst at Joint Research Center of the European Commission, where he connects and strengthens science for policy ecosystems across Europe. Let me tell you something about Lorenzo, which, by the way, is an old friend. He has a PhD in molecular biology and a long career in research on cancer genetics. He has received funding, among others, by the MSCA program. He has a master in policy analysis, and he has been science coordinator at the Spanish Embassy in London and science advisor and diplomacy officer at the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology, FECYT. So, Lorenzo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michele. Thank you, Secretary General for Research, Raquel. Thank you, and welcome, Director in DG EAC, Antonieta. Vice Rector for Research or Science Policy at the University, and for sure, Directors of the Spanish administration, some directors and heads of units at the European Commission, and dear colleagues and friends. I have given the privilege to give this or deliver this keynote speech to talk about this topic. But before starting, I would like to understand better the type of audience I have here. So please, if you consider yourself a policy practitioner or a policy maker, could you raise your hand? Okay. If you consider yourself a researcher, please raise your hand. Okay. How many of you have received a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Action Fellowship in the past or currently? Okay. And the rest of the people? There may be other categories. Okay. Thank you. Well, I was saying that I have the privilege to deliver this talk for 3 reasons. First, because it's the Spanish presidency, and you can tell by my accent that I am Spanish, so it's a great honor to be here. Second, because I used to be a Marie Curie Fellow in London when I was doing my postdoctoral research. I had 2 of my 7 years of postdoctoral research in London funded by this scheme. And third, because the topic is exactly what I am working now at the European Commission's Joint Research Center. And it's how to ensure that scientific research has a bigger input in the policy-making process. So I'm going to make an effort to give you the whole framework of the Science for Policy discourse so that you can discuss further among peers during today's and tomorrow. So first of all, it's distinguishing very clearly what we are talking about. Usually, as scientists, most of the time we talk about policies for science. This is all to do with the planning of the research funding, the research and development and innovation strategy. It's about how to fund research programs, the research career, how it is embedded, the policies also with in the international European framework, or etc. And in all these debates of policies for science, scientists tend to be very proactive. And most of the time, they are also sitting at the policy table as ministers, secretaries generals, secretaries of states, etc. So they are making those policies for science. But what we are talking about today and tomorrow, it's more about science for policy. It's how we can use scientific knowledge to inform policy debate on any other topic, not only restricted to research and development, but most importantly to social affairs, foreign policy, home security, etc. In there, the decision-making is the politician's responsibility, and usually this politician tends not to be an academic expert on the field. but rather he or she receives input, scientific expertise from advisors or from their engagement with the scientific community. Therefore, when we are talking about science for policy, scientists tend to be less proactive and more reactive. But it is true, and Raquel, the Secretary General for Research, has described it, that from time to time, from a ministry, you could put in place policies for science to promote better science for policy. But anyhow, we'll continue this. But science and policy are two different worlds. Most of the time, scientists, they are trying to understand the world, they are trying to solve problems by making scientific research, they like experimentation and discovery. They work independently of the political context most of the time. But when you are dealing with policy making, it's a different set of rules and incentives, the ones that are operating. Politicians and policymakers tend to behave depending on how to manage the world, how to solve problems in a service-oriented manner. They prioritize dialogue and judgment, and political context has a major weight here. So how do we bring together these science and policy worlds in such a way that scientific information can have a bigger influence in policy making? It's something that we keep thinking about, and definitely COVID-19 crisis has been a major wake-up call for everyone. All of us remember these times where we have prime ministers, ministers of health, and next to them there were scientific experts and scientific advisors providing scientific information to the policymakers, but also to the wider public to help us understand the implications of the pandemic. But we also saw loads of frictions when science and policy making are interacting. From scientists trying to advocate for a specific solution, like let's everyone be restricted at home, to politicians and political leaders undermining the credibility of scientific knowledge and also utilizing or shielding their policy making, simply saying, hey, this is what experts are saying, what experts are recommending. Blame the experts if you want, but we need. So, and there are very recent examples or analysis of how this science and policy interaction during COVID-19 crisis behaved or happened in different countries, such as Sweden, the UK, Spain, Greece, etc. I invite you to go online and start checking it if you are interested in that. So, but COVID-19 is just one of the many wicked problems and global challenges that exist. We can talk about aging of the population, we can talk about climate change, famine, inequality, poverty, etc. And in here, we tend to say science could help solve these global challenges. But let's not be naive. There are many more interests at stake. Scientific knowledge can help. I can invite you to check this policy report that an Horizon 2020 research project on science diplomacy, of which I had the pleasure to be a part of. We published the different enablers, stoppers, and warners of how to solve global challenges with the use of science. There are many stoppers that are related to scientific expertise. For instance, the mistrust of science, the lack of a structured policy engagement in scientific institutions, and the ivory tower culture. But most importantly, there are some diplomatic challenges there that are very difficult to overcome. One of them is the tragedy of the commons. It's how we could provide collective action to tackle certain global challenges. Climate change is the best example. There is some scientific evidence that are placed there, but countries don't get along about how to implement the solutions because there are many interests at stake, and we need to be aware that exist in order to play also in that policy-making arena. When scientists approach policymaking, they can perform 4 different idealized roles as per Roger Pilks Jr. in his The Honest Broker book, which if you haven't read it, I kindly encourage you to do so. On the one hand, we can have the pure scientist. The pure scientist is the one that it's doing scientific research. Their most interest is undertaking their scientific research, and from time to time they are called upon to provide advice. They give the scientific information and they don't care about how this lands in the policy table. They don't pursue any specific way of action. That's the pure scientist. Most of the scientists fall within that category. The science arbiter is that type of technical expert who helps very much in the regulatory process to set certain standards, certain modelings, etc. The role is quite technical to set those standards and those policies. And then, much closer to policymaker, we have 2 different idealized roles. The issue advocate, which is one that either for professional or for personal interests, when they provide advice and list a series of the recommendations, they are clearly advocating a specific solution, a specific way of action. Whereas the honest broker is this type of scientist or science advisor who outlines all different policy options with its pros and cons, but they don't really take part, they don't really advocate for a specific solution. That is the realm of the policymaker. And policymaking doesn't happen in a vacuum. There is an intricate process to make a policy from the political vision of the European Commission, when a new president starts its term, to the moment where this is translated into new laws. Okay? This is the intricate process for the EU policymaking process. And in several steps there are hooks for scientific information to come in. One of the best hooks that we have at the European level, it's the Joint Research Center. This is the Science and Knowledge Service of the European Commission. It is like a ministry or like a Secretary of State in any of your countries. Just imagine there is a ministry or Secretary of State, which is the JRC, and it employs 3,000 people who are conducting scientific research based on the political priorities of the European Commission. So all the time, these JRC scientists are trying to provide information to the different services of the European Commission to improve their policies. We have 6 facilities across Europe. The biggest one is the one at Ispra, but we also have in Seville, in Brussels, in Gel, Petten, and Karlsruhe. And we depend on the Director General we depend under Commissioner Iliana Ivanova. And, well, as I said, we have 2,000 active scientists plus 1,000 managers and officers who are trying to build those linkages between the scientific research we conduct and the policy making our colleagues from the other DGs or the other Directorates Generals at the European Commission do. And for sure, we have different platforms for engagement with the scientific community, namely the knowledge centers and the competence centers on specific topics. Let me give you 2 examples why the JRC is such an exemplary science for policy body with case stories. So one, it's paradigmatic of the JRC being this body embedded in the EU policy-making process. Because of that, we accompany all the legislative and political process that comes along with a new policy. One recent example is the Nature Restoration Law that has just been implemented, and in here the JRC was supporting DG Environment from the very beginning to the end, through working groups, inter-service consultations across the European Commission, etc. And it was accompanying this policy-making process by providing modeling, expertise, setting standards and running different scenarios depending on the type of standards and regulations that were going to be implemented and how this could be affecting the future scenarios. The second example is like the JRC being used as an intermediary between the European Union and its member states. And one example is with Spain and the minimum vital income. Here in Spain, the OECD and also the European Commission was commenting that Spain didn't have any good minimal vital income scheme because the ones in place between different regions in Spain, they were highly different and some of them very inefficient. The money didn't get to the people that needed it. So a collaboration between the JRC, the IREF, which is the fiscal authority, the National Authority for Fiscal Responsibility in Spain, and also the Ministry of Inclusion and Social Security, they came along together, and thanks to the JRC being there, the JRC was providing modeling and running different experiments, bringing in different economic models from different regions in Europe and testing them how it could affect in specific regions in Spain. This Euromod modeling technique was very helpful for the Spanish authorities to test it based on the fact that they didn't have a common standards to collect data, but the JRC did have those data. So we built these linkages, and the minimum vital income is now in place at the Spanish national level. It doesn't replace the regional ones, but it complements them. So here, two examples of how this happened. But going back to the COVID-19 pandemic, we at the European Commission realized that the level of scientific expertise or the scientific advice across member states was quite different. And to some extent that the scientific evidence was sometimes contradictory and patchy across member states. This was a wake-up call for us at the European Commission to start talking about how we operate in our science for policy ecosystems, how science and policy making comes together. And from the European Commission, how we could be helpful for member states to make this practice more institutionalized and better. And hence, we published this staff working document or commission document that has been referred before by Antoinetta. And in this document, we provide a shared vision for science for policy. We identify the major challenges that I will talk about it in a bit. And it mostly serves as a catalyzer of an icebreaker to promote European and national debate on this subject, to see how we could improve it. And we identified three challenges for science for policy. The first one is the institutional environment, the fragmentation that exists across member states between scientific organizations and policy-making institutions, and even within policy-making institutions across administrative silos. There are diverse and rich ecosystems that requires better interconnectivity and connections. Around 7 out of 10 respondents to a survey that we put out there to 500 people, experts in policymaking and science, they were referring to the lack of connections and the lack of awareness of advisory bodies. Second is the lack of individual competencies, individual capacities. 62% of the people said that policymakers do not have data literacy or expertise to understand scientific evidence when they are presented with the evidence. And vice versa, around 64% of these survey respondents said that scientists lack communication skills to make clear messages at the right time and in the right setting to policymakers, to convince them or to influence the policy decision. And lastly, the third major challenge is that even though that we have a very good science for policy ecosystem and very competent scientists and policymakers operating, there are certain limits for science to play a major role in policymaking. Politics, the tragedy of commons, as I said before, and many other interests from societal, ideological, religious, etc., come into place and govern the decision-making process. So it is important to understand these limits and to set specific rules, transparency, confidentiality, etc., between scientists and policymakers when they operate with each other. But you can check these challenges further in that document, and we provided certain instruments and tools to help tackle these challenges in the document. To tackle the challenge of the limits of science in policymaking, we can refer to some of our books and policy reports that are part of our Enlightenment 2.0 research project. In there, we try to undertake critical research on the limits of science for policy, understanding how us as humans take our political decisions. Second, or the value, what kind of values we have, or what kind of identity we have, and it plays a role when dealing with scientific expertise. And also how we connect this science and policy bubble with this wider society. Citizen science, deliberative and participatory democratic processes, etc., play a role. You can have a look to those documents should you wish so. But in order to tackle the institutional fragmentations, for the last few years, we have been talking about science for policy ecosystems. And here we are talking about the use of experts in the public administration through scientific councils, scientific committees, ad hoc committees, government think tanks, the research centers that we can, or universities that we can call from the government to get some information. That is all use of experts in public administration. The second aspect is the internal capacity that a public administration has. This has the government a network of science advisors, network of data analysts, foresight units at the Prime Minister's office. Do parliaments have a science and technology office to provide a hook for scientific evidence in the parliamentary debate, and all of that? That's the internal capacity. And third, it has to do with all those processes that make the interactivity and the connection happen, the knowledge exchange happen. Call for evidence. Every new legislation, it has a call for evidence stage where you as a scientist or a scientific institution could provide the scientific information. Impact assessment, policy evaluation, randomized control trials in policy making. It's a great example of co-creation between policymakers and scientists to check which policy will be working best. Open governance, pairing schemes, fellowships in public administration, and so forth. At the JRC, we have conducted also some national exercises, a total of 16 workshops, to understand the quality of your science for policy ecosystem. We try to do a mapping of the system, and that's already a great ice-breaking exercise to get everything on paper and raise awareness about this ecosystem and these interactivities. We have published expert discussion papers to some of these countries, and we have launched a new reform project in 7 member states to undertake this analysis in a more detailed way. And what we can see is that ecosystems are rich and diverse, and they may require more interconnectivity. In here, you may not see, but different actors operate at an ecosystem with different complementary functions. In science for policy, as in any other aspect, there cannot be one ring that rules them all. We can have ministerial advisory councils, chief science advisors, independent research organizations, or the National Academy, and they will be fulfilling different roles in the science and policy interaction. Very recently, and Raquel had mentioned it in her intervention, we organized here in Madrid one of these pilot exercises to map the ecosystem in Spain, and simply by organizing this event, we put in the same room, all the key stakeholders in Spain that are working towards improving how science for policy operates in Spain. And there was a publication of one of these discussion papers that listed certain challenges that exist in Spain. I will not go into detail, but highlight probably the competence building in scientists and policymakers, because if you remember, that was the second challenge I referred to before. And in this example, let's imagine that a policymaker is in a balloon somewhere, she's totally lost, and all of a sudden there is a scientist there in the ground. And the policymaker says, "Hey, where am I?" And the scientists respond, "Well, you're..." Okay, was the information that the scientist gave to the policymaker useful? And similarly, was the question asked by the policymaker good enough? You can understand with this practical example that Lene Top, a former colleague at the Joint Research Center, engineered for our competence building exercises. You can understand the difficult competences and how they operate between scientists and policymakers. These are competence frameworks that competent policymakers and scientists need to operate, need to develop further if they want to better cooperate. And for the policymaker, one of them is be future literacy and work with evidence, while for the scientist, they need to understand, or they need to be good at communicating, but also they need to understand how policymaking operates, who is the right person to talk to. And sometimes this is not the minister or the Secretary of State, but rather the civil servant that is helping them, or the cabinet members. These competence frameworks are available online, and even there is a smartphone policy tool that you can take and you can run your own competences. There are many other material online. The Science for Policy Handbook is totally free, available online. There is an online learning platform, 1 hour long, that you can take, and feel free to test your knowledge and your skills in this field. But going to the intersectoral mobility, most of the time when we talk about intersectoral mobility, we tend to say from science or from academia to industry or from industry to academia, and we tend to leave aside the public administration. But more and more, international organizations and national governments need people with scientific expertise, policy analysts, data analysts, as part of their public administration. The MSCA is a wonderful program. It has, as you will learn, or as you will know, many different schemes, postdoctoral fellowships, staff exchanges, co-fund, doctoral networks, etc. But there is limited participation of public administration in some of these schemes. For instance, public bodies represented only 1% of participation in MSCA under Horizon 2020. And this is in quite a contrast with the 6% of people, MCAA alumni, who are actually working afterwards in public administration after their Marie Curie fellowship. So how we can help get more public administrations to host MSCAs, either as a seconded or as a placement opportunity. We are actually exploring those options together with our colleagues from DG EAC at the European Commission. But this is something yet that we need to think about. Because there are in other countries or in other regions, there are actually fellowships that are targeted for PhD holders to spend time in public administration. It's a project or a fellowship 1 or 2 years long and allows mid to senior career scientists to work at government, parliament, or any state institution. And this encourages their employability. 25% of the scientists who go through this program go back to academia with a different mindset and continue doing scientific research. 25% go to NGOs and private industry, but 50% of those fellows decide to stay in public administration and continue a career there. Fellowships for PhD holders to work in public administration, the most successful one and longest one running is the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship in the United States. Every year, 275 people are selected to go to different government departments. My tax in Canada, it's around 20 a year. And here in Europe, UK has a wide variety of schemes like this. And in Ireland, very recently, they have launched a pilot exercise, and they are on the second call now for 12 scientists to be appointed or allocated at government departments for 1 year. In the EU institutions, well, we have a traineeship program, a Blue Book traineeship program, but only 6% of these Blue Books are PhD holders. Maybe a Blue Book traineeship is not the right instrument to target PhD holders, because it targets mostly recently graduate, recently masters, etc. But the PhD, I mean, if you have a PhD, it's very likely that you will get a Blue Book, but it's not the right mechanism. In any case, we also have the JRC Doctoral Partnership Program and JRC Scientist positions, but you will be working at the JRC, likely conducting scientific research. And we have other instruments, contract agents. You may become an expert working at any other DG with a temporary contract for 6 years, or you prepare competitions and concurses to become civil servant. But we need to do a brainstorming, and these couple of days are meant to do those. And let me tell you, Science for Policy is a new policy emerging at the level of the European Union. From the publication of the Commission document 1 year ago, in October, to a Compet Council debate that happened in December, an ERAC debate in May, June, a Commission conference last October, and now in December, the publication of Council conclusions by the Spanish Presidency, and one of the 3 priorities that are described in those Council conclusions is in relation to Science for Policy. So this is just an ice-breaking exercise. There should be more policies coming in the next few years in this field. But food for thought for you, for the level of the European Commission, it's, well, can we get more support for scientific evidence in this intricate policy-making process that I showed you in one of the slides at the beginning of my talk, in better regulation? How we can promote more mapping, networking, and mutual learning among the European Union member states on the field of Science for Policy? Could we reward Science for Policy in the research assessments of our researchers? More training, how to deliver more training and improved support for intersectoral mobility, properly targeting PhD holders who want to spend 1 or 2 years at the public administration. For governments, national governments, have you got all the boundary organizations that link science and policy closer? And do you support knowledge brokers and honest brokers as a career? Do you support scientific institutions to develop policy impact units the same way that there is units for technology transfer at your universities or units for science communication at your universities? Have you got in your university or research centers a specific policy impact unit that supports your academic staff to have these networking opportunities with policymakers? Do you have any national fellowship to promote this intersectoral mobility? And do you acknowledge and give visibility to this practice? And lastly, for you, Marie Curie Fellows, scientific organizations, scientists, academic researchers, how do you promote platforms for learning and development for your members? Do you have any working group that work on science for policy, not for policy for science, in making sure that the scientific results from your academic membership has an impact on policy making in other aspects, such as social affairs, foreign affairs, etc.? Do you demand your support for science for policy at your academic institution? And do you produce policy outputs? Because academic papers are seldom read by policymakers. Do you have a policy brief, one-page document or two-page document that you could provide to your policymaker when you have a meeting with them? And it is very well written or not? Do you promote knowledge exchange activities in your institutions? Do you bring over policymakers to your center? I mean, these are food for thought. I cannot answer those questions. You, and I hope for the next couple of days, you will get some answers back home and you will help make a move to support and connecting policymaking in the member states with scientific research and promote these diverse research careers to tackle global challenges. Thank you for your attention and hope it was useful for you.